African countries are directly and indirectly affected by U.S. tariffs and the global trade conflict. CGTN's Chao Mghono explains why.
Global trade growth in 2017 was at its strongest since 2011. That's according to the World Trade Organization's annual report. But the WTO is warning that strong performance may be compromised by the escalation of global trade tensions. The WTO says the multilateral trading system can be a force for good globally, promoting stability, creating opportunities, and boosting growth and development. And that's crucial for the developing world. According to experts, emerging markets are struggling to maintain the economic gains. Countries like South Africa are directly affected by U.S. tariffs. It exports around 330,000 tons of steel to the U.S. Economists in South Africa warn that an escalation in the trade spat will lead to further retaliation. That in turn will lead to a global slowdown in trade. Stronger global trade means higher commodity prices. That boosts the economy of commodity-producing nations like South Africa. Analysts say Donald Trump's tit-for-tat protectionism could lead emerging markets under a great deal of pressure. Many African countries have small, open economies with limited domestic markets that need to expand trade. These markets are influenced by growth in the destination trade markets like China, the US, and the EU. If those markets take a hit, so do African economies. Experts in Africa say Donald Trump's escalating rhetoric will lead to more volatility, more vulnerability, and more risk for emerging markets. Chao Mghono, CGTN.
Let's get you more perspective on that. I'm joined from Johannesburg by economist Chris Hart. Chris, which African countries are directly affected by the global trade conflict and which are indirectly affected?
Well, the African countries that have got that are more open, in other words, that depend a lot more on their trade, are the most affected. We already know that the less developed a country is, the more important trade is to their development program, because they don't have the developed domestic industries to produce what, say, an advanced economy does. And so these trade barriers are important, because to effectively afford imports, you have to be able to export. And the countries effectively also are affected by, if trade is constricted in the world, economic growth, global economic growth is also constricted, and that brings down commodity prices disproportionately, from that particular point of view. So we really need to look at the actual ability of the global economy to continue to grow, because that actually feeds back into commodity prices, and also the ability of African countries to actually export and afford the imports that they do need.
Right, and just explain it to us how commodity-driven economies in Africa are at risk.
Well, basically the first thing is that when it comes to commodity prices, they're very dependent on the actual strength of the global economy. And commodities are also traded, they also form an extremely important part of the actual trade equation in the actual, in the global trade flows. And so when the global economy slows down, you find that commodity prices come down by more than what the growth would come down by, for example. And that then feeds back into African economies, as I said, disproportionately more than it would be the case, say, for a more advanced economy. The more advanced economies are more resilient and more able to actually cope with a trade war than the smaller, less developed African economies.
All right. But on the other hand, Chris, Africa could be a potential destination market. How can the continent take advantage of this opportunity?
Well, I think the main issue is that firstly, some of the commodities, Africa is in fact dominant, and they can actually possibly use market power, but that's not really a great option. I think the end result of this trade war, it's only at the beginning stages. We may actually see tariffs come down, and protectionism, especially in the form of agricultural subsidies that you see in advanced countries that the less developed countries can't match. If these come down, it actually may in the end produce an advantage, at least a possibility for Africa to come in the space and be able to place their goods if at the end of the day tariffs come down. We have seen Trump actually putting down if tariffs are equal or low, and he has proposed like no tariff regime. That can be an advantage for Africa if we actually see the ability to actually place goods into the markets. One of the problems with the World Trade Organization is that agricultural subsidies are high in the developed world, and these are holy cows that don't want to be touched, and that's what puts some asymmetry in place. And so hopefully the end result of this, nobody wins from a trade war, but if we can actually see ultimately tariffs coming down, it can provide an opportunity for Africa.
Chris, thank you for your time. Chris Hart for us in Johannesburg.